the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For its consideration of this agenda item, the Forum has before it notes of the Secretariat contained in document E/C.19/2023/6 entitled Implementing Free, Prior, and Informed Consent in the Context of Indigenous Peoples. I now give the floor to Mr. Alexei Цыкарев to present this document. Alexei, you have the floor.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for the opportunity to tell you about the study regarding free, prior and informed consent, FPIC, in the context of Indigenous peoples. Dear Forum participants, brothers and sisters, I should like to thank members of the Permanent Forum, former colleagues as well, for entrusting me with the preparation of this study, which will hopefully make a contribution to the practice surrounding FPIC, also opening up additional opportunities for broadening the application of this principle by the private sector. Now, the study focuses on the unique and mutually dependent character of this human rights principle. The study views FPIC from the vantage point of fairness, dialogue, and as an instrument for building capacity, the capacity of both companies and Indigenous persons. It also puts forward a number of examples and methodologies for putting FPIC into practice. I agree that human rights obligations cannot be delegated by governments to any private company, whatever company that may be. However, we must recognize that private companies must also secure the consent of Indigenous peoples and enter into agreements with them in keeping with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. However, as a number of states have not transposed FPIC into their national legislation, the voluntary application of this principle by private companies can be useful, as it helps us to introduce this principle, to put it into practice de facto. This will, in turn, hopefully spur legislative reforms. It is a specific case of broadening the use of FPIC, which might itself result in legislative change. As things stand, companies have greater room for maneuver when it comes to introducing FPIC vis-a-vis governments. And in fact, the private companies should be duty-bound like states are, like governments are, to use these principles. If they stray from them, well, they might suffer reputational damage and also financial losses. The practice of using FPIC is evolving as practice of securing Indigenous peoples' rights also evolves. And thus, we might be able to achieve a certain degree of flexibility surrounding FPIC practice, both at the international and national levels. This is because different Indigenous peoples have different forms of self-government, different decision-making models, and historically, they have very different relationships with both governments and the private sector. However, when I say flexibility, we do not, and I repeat, we do not mean watering down the key components of FPIC. As I mentioned, they are mutually dependent, they influence one another, so you cannot take any of the components of FPIC in isolation. There are many examples from the Russian Federation, the USA, and Asia. Not all of these examples are conventional examples of FPIC being put into practice. However, there is a common denominator, something that brings together all of these practices, all of these examples, and that is the fact that there are agreements on FPIC. What we saw is that there are examples of Indigenous peoples not insisting on FPIC because they already have agreements or are already cooperating with companies in Russia, in Taimyr. There was a case where companies were investing in residential areas being built and also meat processing facilities for Indigenous peoples. And this was seen as something that came out of a direct demand emanating from the Indigenous peoples in question. Therefore, no FPIC-based agreement was required. There are other examples. For instance, some Indigenous peoples have actually criticized companies for implementing FPIC principles, saying that this was being used as a pretext to drag out decision-making, to delay decision-making. Nevertheless, we believe that when FPIC is implemented, Indigenous persons and peoples always benefit. The whole operation becomes more transparent and companies are held to account. As part of the study, FPIC is viewed as a comprehensive process that is characterized by a number of actions, and all parties have to agree on these actions. FPIC cannot be taken in isolation from due diligence, from planning on how to collaborate with Indigenous peoples, thinking about the impact of industrial activities, compensation, acting in good faith. All of this is part and parcel of the process of implementing FPIC. However, if we look at fairness and the role that FPIC plays therein, it's important to note that it's not all about the money. Whether an agreement is fair does not boil down to how much money the company gives to Indigenous persons, whether that be by investing in their sustainable development, whether it be by paying out compensation. It's really about whether this relationship stands the test of time, whether the agreement is going to be implemented for many years to come. Money cannot offset Indigenous persons' rights to culture. For instance, it's very difficult to calculate the impact on languages. This cannot be expressed, the value of language cannot be expressed in monetary terms. And here I would now like to quote Mr. Dario Semihia Montalvo, the chairperson of the forum, who said that in order to maintain their identity, Indigenous peoples need three kinds of opportunities. They need the right to manage their lands, they need the right to think how in the way their ancestors did, and they need the right to make their own decisions. When we talk about FPIC, we are translating these three principles I just mentioned into legislation. I completely agree with the chairperson of the Permanent Forum. Distinguished colleagues, before I conclude, I wanted to add that the study does draw a number of conclusions. I'm not going to read you the full list, but I did want to underscore three findings. First, companies should stop viewing Indigenous persons as stakeholders. Instead, they need to recognize the collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples. In other words, Indigenous peoples should be viewed as rights holders, not stakeholders. Second, the international community needs to promote the gradual evolution of practice by collating documentation and exchanging experience. Now, we live at a time when international relations are being put to the test. However, we need to continue this process of exchange of views. The use of the FPIC principle, well, it's a process, and we need to learn how to put this principle into practice. We need to set precedents so that neither companies nor governments fear using this principle in practice. What are some examples of best practice? Well, we can look to Indigenous peoples for those. They can act as mediators between those who suffer at the hands of these companies and the companies themselves. I'd like to thank everybody who partook in the deliberations of this session referencing this specific study. I hope that just like previous studies conducted by the expert mechanism, the permanent forum, the special rapporteur, that this study will serve as the foundation for further enhancing the practice of applying FPIC around the world. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.